All right, joining me for this episode is my good friend Taylor Keeland. Frequent viewers of the channel may recognize Taylor. We were just on a panel together at the Naval Institute a few weeks ago. Taylor is the author of Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, which is a definitive work about that cohort of 500 some POWs. And she's done some amazing study about the resilience and the other attributes of that group, unique group of Vietnam era POWs. But her latest book, which has just come out today, is called Unwavering. And it is an in depth look at, let's call it, the war on the home front during this same period. So the book opens, Taylor, in Paris at the Vietnam peace talks, and the wives are sitting down with this North Vietnamese delegation. It's kind of eerie, actually, the presentation they give them, the attitude they give them.
It's interesting because this was the first time that family members had really been put in a position of serving as diplomats or war negotiators. What I find so interesting is that these were women who were unschooled in diplomacy. They were unschooled in public speaking. They were unschooled in foreign affairs. And yet the US government let them go and speak on behalf of their husbands and their families and make their pleas directly to the North Vietnamese, which I don't think had ever been done before.
Well, you say let them go. This was a hard fought access that really started in 1965. The other thing that was interesting about that particular scene was when the spouses asked specific questions of the North Vietnamese principals, the government officials, like, I know my husband was shot down on, let's say, March 5th, 1966. Can you verify that he's alive? And their answers were right out of Cold War Iron Curtain propaganda 101, which is, we cannot verify if your husband is alive because oftentimes when the airplanes are shot down, they land in the water or they crash in the wreckage. It's hard to determine the status. And so they're giving them like these robotic Orwellian responses that didn't engender any comfort,
Right.
And so they walked out of there kind of like, what was that? But let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning. And the book definitely chronicles the struggles, the plight, the courage of a few principles, and we'll talk about several of the main ones. But it starts with the beginning of the war. And so they're dealing with the Johnson administration. What I had forgotten until I read the book was Admiral Stockdale, at this time as a commander. So Sybil winds up being, let's just call her the leader of this national family group. But by the time he gets involved in the war, he's a pretty senior officer. And so they've been married for 20 years. And so she's kind of like got this kind of been there, done that attitude. Jim's a great pilot. He went to test pilot school. He's flown hundreds, thousands of sorties off of aircraft carriers. So this Navy official briefs the wives, a spouse group, and says kind of like, be advised, they could get shot down. And her response is kind of like, well, not Jim. He's
Right.
a great pilot, right?
Right. You have to remember you call it Navy spouses, but they were all wives. There were no husbands there at this lunch. So, as you and I both know, um, Navy wives groups in the 60s and 70s were sort of the glue of the home front in military communities. And the senior officer's wife was responsible for keeping those ladies together as a group. And she was by virtue of her husband's rank, she was the senior ranking wife. And I think it's instructive for those of your watchers, viewers, and listeners to understand what life was like for women at this time in 1965. Um, they really had only three jobs available to them, right? Stewardess, teacher, secretary, I'll give it a fourth, nurse. But once they got married and had children, a lot of those jobs were not available to them. They could not get a mortgage or a car on their own without their husband's or father's signature. Although the birth control pill was around, it was in existence. It was many doctors wouldn't prescribe them to single women, and married women sometimes had to get the permission of their husbands to be prescribed birth control pills. There were many restrictions placed on women at that time. They didn't travel alone. Some of them told me we didn't go out to dinner alone. And for military wives, the restrictions were even greater. They had to abide by the protocols and the rules that governed their husbands. And so in 1965, Sybil Stockdale hosted a Navy wives group in her home in Coronado, California. And she invites this Navy public affairs officer. She describes him as a pudgy redhead. And he walks into the house about an hour late. She wasn't even sure he was going to show up. And she says he just loved all the attention he received. And he got up in front of the ladies and he basically told them, look, there is a possibility that your husband could be shot down and captured by the North Vietnamese. But let me tell you, we have all assurances that these men are being treated well. And he passes around letters that he has from Everett Alvarez and Bob Shoemaker to their wives. And he said, I want you to know that I am here for you. And if this happens to you, I do not want you speaking to anyone in the press. I don't want you speaking to anyone in your neighborhood. You are not to tell anyone about the plight of your husband, whether he is captive or missing. And she said she wrote all this out in a lengthy reflection, is the best way I can describe it, which I found at the Hoover Institution. And she basically said, she looked around and she said, I've never heard anything like this before. This is so silly to scare these young wives unnecessarily. And some of them came up to her afterwards at the end of the day, wide-eyed, saying, I don't know what to think about this. I've only been married a few months. Mrs. Stockdale, what should I do? And she said, oh, don't give it another thought. They'll come home safely. Well, that was May of 65, and her husband was shot down and went missing in September of 65.
Obviously, that changed everything. The flow of information was not awesome, to put it mildly. But you mentioned the PAO sort of put out this edict: don't talk to the press. We got you. We'll take care of you. We should say up front, as you are sort of positing, these wives are not like political activists from the get-go. They are biased to being loyal to the agencies their husbands work for, in this case, the U.S. Navy or Air Force and Marine Corps. So they didn't start this journey as cynical advocates that didn't trust the government. They believed unconditionally the things they were told at that time.
Right. And in defense of the Defense Department and the State Department actually had the lead on negotiating for the release of Cold War prisoners or captives. In their defense, up until that point, quiet back channel diplomacy had worked to release the few men we had behind enemy lines. Think about the case of Gary Powers. So they had no reason to believe that when we had a few POWs, by spring of 65, we had a handful. They had no reason to believe that this policy and this tactic wouldn't work. And so they refused to go public and battle the North Vietnamese in the court of public opinion. They felt that it was much more prudent to use back channel diplomacy to try and secure an early release. And let's face it, who in 1964 and 65 thought that a little skirmish in Vietnam would last as long as it would?
Yeah. So, like you said, they didn't want to do anything that would hazard the repatriation of the few POWs that they had. Like you said, Alvarez, Shoemaker. And then you guys do a great job of sort of situating the campaign that changed everything for the aviators, and that is Rolling Thunder.
Right. So in March of 65, not only did we land troops in South Vietnam, but we started the bombing campaign. And we started losing lots and lots and lots of men. Many went missing and many were captured. And so all of a sudden, these handful of POWs became hundreds of POWs and hundreds of missing men.
Now it's a different dynamic. The flow of information is non-existent. It's hard for them to know whether their husbands were killed or missing or wounded or in captivity. They would get these anecdotal things from their wingman. Yeah, I saw Jim's airplane was in flames when it went down. That's the last thing I saw. I didn't see a shoot. That doesn't mean he's dead. This kind of stuff. And you can imagine being a wife, in on base at Coronado or Oceana or wherever, and you're like, what's going on with Jim? And the squadron comes back from deployment, and now you can hear directly from the rest of his squadron mates. You're like, yeah, I was on his wing, and this is all I saw. That's all I know. I'm sorry. And then you go to the Department of the Navy or State Department, and they're like, I'm sorry, ma'am, we don't know. All we know is what his wingman told us and what the official report says, and that's it. So there's no satisfaction for years and years. So, as you mentioned, because of Rolling Thunder and the escalation of hostilities, the numbers of POWs grows exponentially. How do these wives wind up finding each other ultimately and forging this bond? First to find out information, and then ultimately they become basically an advocacy group that created an outcome.
Sybil initially abided by the keep quiet policy, as did many of the women, most of the women. And it was very isolating for these women. It was lonely for these women. They were scattered all over the country. Many of them had their powers of attorney expire. And so they were left without an opportunity to buy a house, get a car. Some of them had trouble getting their paychecks from. It was tough. But an interesting thing happened. Two interesting things happened. There was the Hanoi March in July of 66, which you're probably familiar with. And that was when the North Vietnamese decided that they would parade 52 of the POWs through the streets of Hanoi and show the world what they thought of these POWs and to give the North Vietnamese people a chance to vent their anger on these air pirates. They thought that they would show the world that they were abiding by the Geneva Conventions, but it backfired on them. The international outrage over the parading of these men who were shackled together, being pelted with trash and being spit on and being beaten in the streets of Hanoi backfired on them. And the international outrage from the diplomatic community and the press and Congress was swift and loud. And all of a sudden, the talks, which had been hinted at and rumored and in the press for the last couple of months about a threat of war crimes trials against these men, dissipated. And all of a sudden, the US diplomats realized, hey, the North Vietnamese are vulnerable to world opinion. So that was incident number one. Second incident was the capture of the USS Pueblo, which happened in January of 68. Unlike the capture of the Vietnam POWs, the capture of the USS Pueblo crew and the ship made international news immediately. And negotiations to secure the release of these men was initiated almost immediately. And the CO's wife, Rose Bucher, was thrust into the spotlight with a press conference almost the same day that this incident occurred. She was in the national spotlight almost immediately, and she didn't get out of the spotlight. She went and met with Secretary Rusk. She went on national press tours. She spoke at the American Legion convention saying, remember the Pueblo, remember the Pueblo. And guess what? That crew was released in 9 months. They came home, I believe it was Christmas Eve of 1968. Meanwhile, by December of 68, we'd had POWs in captivity in North Vietnam for 4 years. So I believe that a lot of the Vietnam POW and MIA wives looked at Rose Bucher, and while many of them did not like the fact that she broke with the go public, the keep quiet policy, I think they saw that she got results.
So, just like we discussed during our conversation with Porter Halliburton at the Naval Institute, as we're studying this entire group as a cohort,
Mm-hmm.
you, through your research in Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton, have flagged that they're educated, well led, had sort of this healthy cynicism about any circumstance, which is unique to aviators, perhaps military aviators. So this group of wives was the perfect counterpart to that. So these women in general, we won't paint with a unified brush here because they're all unique and different. They started this journey as loyal, sit down, be the good spouse, be the good wife, take care of the kids, keep the home front good to go. And then the more and more that they started to attempt to find things out and then affect an outcome by working with the proper channels. Again, their first move isn't to protest, or throw stuff at the Pentagon. Their first move is to take a meeting with, it would start with the chief of naval personnel, and then it would go to, can we sit down with the CNO, and then can we talk to the chairman, Moorer and the folks like that. And what they realized was they were either being slow rolled or lied to, like to their face. And so you guys do a beautiful job as you go through the sort of prism that is Sybil Stockdale of how her attitude changes, because she's nobody's fool. That's why she put up with Jim all those years. A very strong personality, great couple. She's as strong, if not stronger, than he is, and that's saying a lot. So her, let's just call it transition from aye, sir, what can I do, to I'm going to solve this on my own, is kind of the tale here. So let's talk about the triggers, if you will, that created that in Sybil Stockdale.
Sybil started meeting with a handful of San Diego area POW and MIA wives as early as October of 66. She reached out through the only communications mechanisms that were available to Americans at the time, which were the telephone and letters, right? You could use a telegram if you needed something in writing super urgently, like overnight. But through telephones and letters, she rounded up about 12 women in the area who were in the same predicament that she was. And she wasn't sure. She invited them over to her house in October of 66. And she said she wasn't sure they were going to come. They were so, so scared. They had been so frightened by the edict to keep quiet that she wasn't sure they were gonna show up and talk, but they did. And it was a release valve, if nothing else, for that small group of women. But they started to realize that there was some power in their numbers. And they started communicating on a more regular basis, getting together once a month. And then when Nixon was elected president in January of 69, on the eve of his inauguration, she initiated what she called a telegram in. She got together with the San Diego group of women and said, there's got to be something we can do to grab the attention of this new president. We have great hopes that he is going to do more to get our men home than Johnson did. And so they initiated a telegram campaign where they mailed thousands of telegrams to the president to arrive on his desk on the eve of the inauguration. And again, they just called each other on the phone, wrote letters, and said, please send a telegram, send one to the president, send one to the Secretary of State nominee, send one to the Secretary of Defense. The White House was deluged with these telegrams. And so I think Nixon knew early on, and I found some indications through memos and in the White House and the Nixon library, that they were scratching their heads saying, how many of these are there out there? But the big person who really made a big difference was Mel Laird. And he became their highest level advocate in the White House and in the administration.
So explain to the viewers who Melvin Laird was.
Melvin Laird was a congressman from Wisconsin who had actually met with several of the POW and MIA wives when he was in Congress, who was appointed to be Nixon's Secretary of Defense. And so he was familiar with the women. He came into the Pentagon, and he had a dutiful assistant named Richard Capon, who was a Copley News publishing executive that he hired to be his assistant. And he said, I feel like these families and these men have been what he called the unmentionables up till now. And I want you to go, Dick, I want you to go and do research. I want you to go to all the 3-letter agencies around the area, the CIA, the DIA, and I want you to see what evidence we have of mistreatment of the POWs. Gather all the intel. And he did. And what the intelligence community had been collecting and basically just warehousing was tremendous evidence of mistreatment and torture and poor health care and poor diets. They were violating just about every tenet of the Geneva Conventions. But because we had been pursuing this quiet back channel diplomatic attempts for 4 years now to try and get these men home, they hadn't used this intelligence as propaganda. And when Mel Laird read all of this intelligence, he said, by God, we're going to go public. He called Sybil Stockdale on the morning of the press conference, and he said, you're going to be really excited about what we're about to do. We're going to hold a press conference, and I'm going to speak at this press conference, and we're going to tell the world what you've been advocating. And that is that the North Vietnamese are not abiding by the Geneva Conventions.
So we had evidence of this. Again, as you mentioned, people have to understand, young people have to understand that these are the days before cell phones and laptops. Like you said, the means were landlines. Remember, we used to have these long ass cords that would go through our houses, and if we had a red phone, we were like, "Oh, this is cool! I have a red phone," right? That kind of thing, and letters. So the other thing, and this was a big deal at the house when the latest issue of National Geographic, Sports Illustrated, Look, and Life would show up. Inside of Life magazine was a picture that gave Alice Stratton, the wife of Dick Stratton, an A-4 pilot who actually shot himself down when his Zuni rockets collided in front of him and fought at his motor. Heard him speak a number of times when I was a mid. He's a fantastic speaker and a great guy. Call sign Beak because he has a big nose, but he's quite a personality, big, tall guy. But there's this picture in Life magazine of him bowing in his POW pajamas. And that was her first indication that he was alive and not being treated well.
That was a seminal moment, obviously, for the U.S. government. And they actually did issue a statement in that Life magazine. Avril Harriman was quoted in that issue saying, it's clear that they are brainwashing him and mistreating him.
So let's talk about Harriman, because Harriman was not an ally at the beginning, right? I mean, he was not terribly helpful from the outset.
He was not. I mean, I think he was in his early 70s by the time the Vietnam War came around. So he was not a young man, but he was still pretty active in his career. And he was appointed, Johnson appointed him, or maybe it was Kennedy that appointed him. I think it was Kennedy appointed him to the State Department. But by the time Johnson became president, Averill Harriman was serving as the point man on the POW issue. And again, he was a seasoned World War II diplomat, had been around for a long time, preferred to work quietly through the diplomatic channels. And he met with Sybil twice and told her, what we're doing to attempt to improve the treatment of your husband and get him home and get an accounting for the missing is significant, but it's also classified. So I can't share it with you. And she met with him 2 times over the course of 12 months. And she said she got the same placating pat on the head.
And what she realized in that explanation was he was actually lying to her because they had evidence. They didn't want to reveal it. And this is where the Johnson administration, particularly, and the early Nixon administration, but the Johnson administration, what emerges in the book is they were not terribly helpful at all at the early part of the war and when it started getting ugly. And as you said, the POW's existence became sort of an analog for how badly the war was going. Right? We're like the most powerful nation in the world. We can't get our men back. We're at odds, at a loss to get these guys back from this third world country. And that just got worse and worse. So politicians respond to things that are going to keep them in office or things that have overwhelming public support. And so this is what Sybil was creating over the years. It didn't start with overwhelming public support, but when she was first dealing with Harriman, she's like, okay, you say classified. I'm like, I'm not pushing that. I know that classified's a thing that you don't go beyond. So she accepted that until she realized that now it's just a way to shut me up.
It's just a way to shut me up, right?
And that's not going to work. And so from there, this organization, the National League of Families, started doing its own thing, and became a real force.
They did. They realized that there was power in numbers. And like I said, when Sybil gave that first newspaper interview in October of 68, she really opened the floodgates. The San Diego Union, I believe, was syndicated by Copley. And so that article appeared in newspapers around the country. She started getting phone calls and letters from wives in similar predicaments all over the nation saying, I thought I was just alone. I didn't realize that there were so many others who were suffering under the same predicament and suffering in silence. So they started organizing. They started lobbying, walking the halls of Congress. They started going to Paris to meet with the North Vietnamese. And they started traveling around the world, meeting with world leaders. And all of a sudden, they were getting tremendous press, and tremendous sympathy from Americans. And Nixon, in his infinite wisdom and his administration, realized that, hey, this is a group of women that could really help us. They could be our advocates. Nixon gave his silent majority speech in November of 69, and I think he had women like these wives in mind when he was talking about his silent majority. And sure enough, while they would not say that they were used by the Nixon administration, and I don't like to use that term, he certainly enlisted them in his Go Public campaign and was able to tap into the sympathies that they engendered and make the issue of the POWs humanitarian. And that was the turning point. That's what made the fate of these men an absolute national priority, because the whole nation got behind the plight of the men. They were not necessarily uniformly in support of the average fighting man fighting on the front lines in Vietnam. They certainly were divided over the battle tactics and the war that we were fighting, but they were uniformly and unanimously in support of getting these men home because these women turned it into such a humanitarian issue.
And getting the men home didn't necessarily eclipse ending the war, but it became as big of a motivation for the American public. There were two brilliant marketing materials, let's call it, in this process.
Hmm.
Let's talk about those things.
Well, I'm wearing one of them. It's a POW bracelet of Captain Mel Moore, who just died about 2 or 3 years ago at the age of 90. So he had a great second chance at freedom and a nice long life. But these little cuffs, these aluminum cuffs, were the brainchild of a couple of college girls and their friends who were part of a college organization, a campus organization called Viva. And they were the counter to the anti war protesters that were all over college campuses in the US. And they were looking for ways to support our troops. They were introduced to Bob Dornan, a longtime congressman from Southern California, but during the Vietnam War, he was a Los Angeles radio host, a very popular radio host, and had a short stint as an actor and interesting guy. He also was a strong supporter of the war, what you might call a firebrand conservative. And he was really taken with these students and said, let's find out ways that you can help the men. He said, I want you to meet 3 MIA wives from the Los Angeles area. And 2 of them are in our book, Carol Hansen and Pat Mearns. These ladies, Carol Bates was probably the leader of the pack, sat down with these MIA wives, and together they came up with an idea as to how they could generate some publicity and support for the missing and captive men. Bob Dornan was wearing a cuff that had been given to him by one of the Montagnards, and they looked at that cuff and they said, let's do something like this. Let's make a cuff that has the name of an individual POW or missing man. And they made them in copper because apparently copper at the time had, people think it has medicinal value. And they made thousands and thousands of these, and they launched the campaign in the fall of 1970, and they sold more than 5 million of these bracelets to everyday Americans all over the country. Frank Sinatra wore one, Sonny and Cher wore one, Ronald Reagan wore one. Everybody, whether they were for or against the war, was in support of these men. The fate of these men became personal for Americans.
And the other thing, and this is something we see a lot these days, is the POW MIA flag.
Right, and sadly, the families never trademarked that image because, as one POW brother said to me, Bob Brudno, he said, "We didn't think we would need it for so long," but they wanted a symbol, some sort of a symbol, a logo, if you will, for the National League of Families, the organization they created, and so they came up with this flag. And now, of course, you can't drive 5 miles in this country without seeing that flag.
The other thing the book captures at the height of this effort is these wives are getting hit on by staffers and, Sybil's psychiatrist, although he's semi kidding. But, these are women who are, dealing with the landscape at the time. And this is against a backdrop, as you said from the outset, maybe young people these days don't understand just how different America was in 1965. So between 65 and 72, we have civil rights, equal rights.
Man landed on the moon.
Yeah, right. Technology, NASA program. It's interesting that you mentioned that when they met with the North Vietnamese delegation in Paris, a few days earlier, the Woodstock Festival had happened. I just watched the director's cut of Woodstock, and what seemed so dangerous at the time, because I saw the Woodstock movie in the theater in 1970, the hippies and the whole vibe just seems so dangerous when you're, 11 years old. And now it looks kind of quaint and a little bit cliche. But at the time, this was earth-shattering protest movement, end the war. They believed very much that they were the catalyst for ending the war. But really, if you look at this group headed by Sybil Stockdale, it's like they're actually moving the ball forward in a way that's persistent, quiet, and effective, right? And these were not Jane Fonda fans. This group of wives was very patriotic, and they just had enough with being lied to, and they, through their own pluck and resilience, because again, in some cases their husbands have been gone for 6-7 years, they're like, we're just going to make it happen.
I try to remind young people today, somebody who's in their 20s or 30s, I said, okay, do you remember staying up all night long or getting up in the middle of the night and watching the royal wedding of William and Kate, or if you're old enough, watching the royal wedding of Charles and Diana? And they said, oh yeah, I got up in the middle of the night, I set my alarm, I got up. Or, oh, we had a wedding watching party at my house. And I said, that was what the POW Homecoming was like in 1973. Millions of Americans got up in the middle of the night to watch the return of these POWs live on television, because they first landed at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. So it was in the middle of the night in Washington, D.C. and California. By the time the POWs came home, the fate of those 591 men had become an absolute national priority, and their homecoming a national celebration. Not so for the 2.1 million who served in Vietnam. Not so for them. They came home one by one on a commercial airplane and had to take off their uniform in the bathroom so that they wouldn't be spit on when they're walking through the airport. But the fate of those 591 men played an outsized role in the negotiating for the end of the war, and they became pretty much the only victory. Their homecoming was a national celebration like we had just never seen before. When the POWs came home, most of the POW wives dropped out of the National League of Families. They got their men home. What was left of the organization, and what still exists as the organization, is the MIA families. Unfortunately, there was a lot of controversy over the missing men and getting a full accounting of the missing men. And that started almost immediately after the Paris Peace Accords were signed. And it had mostly to do with the small number of POWs who came home from Laos. We had hundreds of men missing there, and 9 were returned. And unfortunately, when Kissinger was trying to negotiate for a more complete list from Laos, he was also in the process of delivering a promise of reparations to North Vietnam. And although it wasn't intentional, a quid pro quo was established. Well, reparations were never given and provided to North Vietnam. And so the families alleged that because of that, the remaining POWs were never returned. And there were many of them who never, ever disavowed themselves of the belief that we left men behind and that the government covered it up. And the last third of my book is all about the MIA controversy that was started during the spring of 73 and really did not abate until the mid-90s.
Just like we're saying, there was this national phenomenon around wrist bracelets and MIA flags and get the men home. The nation moves on. People are living their lives, and the Vietnam War is over. They don't want to be reminded of this trauma that was Vietnam. And the political will absolutely wasn't there during Ford and Carter, particularly. They were dealing with their own inflation, Iran hostage crisis. Jimmy Carter's, while he was a great post-president, he wasn't an awesome president. Those years were very challenging, one-term president. So the last thing he wanted to do was introduce another controversy to his administration. So they had zero interest in pursuing the MIA thing.
Right. Despite the fact that thousands of refugees who were leaving Vietnam when South Vietnam fell were claiming that they had seen live Americans held against their will. So the intelligence agencies were, very busy trying to track down all these live sightings, interview refugees. The families insisted that the government establish a permanent organization to try and ferret out the issue of the missing. And was JCRC, the Joint Casualty Resolution Center, which changed its names many, many times and is now DPAA, the Defense POW MIA accounting agency. Unfortunately, because of all these refugees' live sightings and a lot of con men and charlatans in the 1980s who claimed that they could go rescue these men. There were private rescue missions that were funded and undertaken. Ross Perot got involved again. He was a tireless advocate for the men and the wives during the war. He was one of those true believers who never ever stopped believing that we left men behind.
Well, there's an interesting episode of the Sante raid and the heartbreak of that,
Right.
where they come back and they say to one wife, we know he was there.
Right.
Right. So Ross Perot, American patriot, and he funded Sante as well as what we were talking about later.
Unfortunately, by the 80s, he had become quite a gadfly. Not a gadfly. He'd become a fly in the ointment of the Reagan administration. He was spending time in Hanoi, meeting with leaders, acting as an unofficial American diplomat. He was providing money to some of these con men and charlatans and Rambos who were claiming that they could go stage private rescue missions. And he didn't help the cause of obtaining a full accounting of the missing. Of course, it came to a crescendo in 1991 and 1992 when the Senate Select Committee was established, headed by Senator Bob Smith from New Hampshire, Senator John Kerry, and Senator John McCain. And they spent 2 years interviewing thousands and thousands of people and trying to uncover whether or not there was any evidence that we left men behind. And they determined there wasn't.
Well, you mentioned that Ross Perot became a fly in the ointment. I think what the readers will take away is how do you work within the system? And then if you have to work outside of the system, how do you make the system ultimately follow you and not fight you? And that's what Sybil Stockdale kind of did with this association that she led during these years. The other legacy from reading the book that jumps out at me is because what are the stats in World War II? We left how many? 72,000, and then Korea it was 6,000 and some.
Yes.
Right. And so what this what this wives group created was this really actionable process for no man left behind. And so if you look at what we've done in the post 9/11 conflicts, we will go to the ends of the earth literally to get back one service member. And so to my mind, that is the legacy of the work that these Vietnam era POW wives did.
It really is remarkable to me that it's this group of women that set in motion this policy that is really, really enforced now. All you have to do is look at the cases of, you can go pre 9/11. You could look at the case of Scott O'Grady in 1993. I mean, we just expend tremendous resources to recover just one.
The book is unwavering. The author is my good friend Taylor Keelan. Her co-author is Judy Gray. Taylor, thank you for spending some time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/wardcarroll. In the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.